Now, if you were injured and had a broken leg, let's say, sometimes we get the idea that a broken leg in the 18th century meant amputation, but that's not always the case. A simple break could be set. They were setting bones long before the time of Fort Loudoun. You line that bone back up with itself. You put a good splint upon it to hold that bone good and steadily, and eventually that bone should fuse, should grow back together. But if it were a compound break, if it was broken in a number of places, sticking through the skin, that was a wound we could not fix. And if we left it untreated, it was very likely you were going to die from that. So we couldn't fix it as it was. It was unlikely to fix itself. And the only option that really left us was to turn it into a wound we could manage. And that means amputation. Now, while the implements I have here look pretty poor to us today with our expectations, they were incredibly advanced compared to where they had been. Earlier amputations, we didn't know it was a bad idea to cut through bone and flesh evenly, so we did. Leaving the bone showing, the bone would blacken, it would flake off, the patient almost always died. But we knew they'd die if we did nothing. We had to give them some chance. Early amputations, we did not have a good way to stop the blood above the knee, the upper leg. Your earlier tourniquets just did not do a sufficient job, so your patients would typically bleed to death even with the use of pressure points. But by the time of Fort Loudoun, the screw-in tourniquet takes care of that problem. It gets better pressure. We can amputate higher, more successfully. And perhaps the most horrifying to me, your earlier amputations, we did not have a good way to stop the blood after the limb was removed. So frequently the solution there was to dip the stump in boiling oils. If that's not torture, it's hard to imagine what is. But by the time of Fort Loudoun, we have another means. So now we know to go through the flesh and to the bone, but not through the bone with this capital knife. And once that's done, I'd choose one of my separators. If it's the upper arm or upper leg with one bone, I'd use the one with one hole. The lower with two bones, use the one with two holes. Slide this into the cut we've made. Your bone would stick through like my finger does, and as I pull back, I'm separating flesh, I'm exposing bone, but even more importantly, I'm preserving some of that flesh that's going to come back like a natural cover and help cover that tip of the bone when we're done. And the next thing I do is saw through the bone. For smaller bones, I can use the metacarpal saw. Larger bones, I'll use the capital saw. And I like to talk my patients through this first, kind of put their minds at ease, but in a few moments, ma'am, when we get to this stage, that leg will no longer be attached, but the amputation's not complete. Instead of dipping that stump in boiling oils, I will instead use my tenaculum. Those arteries draw back in a bit when they're cut. So this allows me to go into the stump, hooking the arteries, pulling them out just ever so slightly. And down here I'd have loops of horsehair. They're already tied in knots, they're just not tightened down. And I'll slide this off of the shaft and onto the artery, tightening down to stop the blood flow. Ideally, I'd want to use this on the veins too, but if you imagine a battle has just ended with multiple people hurt, if I spend that much time on the first person, I won't have the time to get to the others. They won't last that long. So in that case, I'll use this on the artery still, but I will back off to the cauterizing iron and use this to seal off the veins. Once that's done, I'm going to slowly loosen the tourniquet, observe to see if there are places needing further attention, and if not, I'm going to put a dressing upon them, oftentimes cattail lint from the plant, not the beast. We've still found very little benefit the beast brings, but the plant is rather handy. Linen bandages. I'm not sewing the stump back up yet. We actually wish to observe the wound for a few days, see that healing process, and believe that the formation of pus was a good thing. It showed you were getting through some of the most painful parts of that healing process and on the road to recovery. Now, oftentimes people will hear about the formation of pus and think, well, this is an age before the antibiotics. And indeed, had we had every antibiotic known today, we'd have cast them all aside as worthless because we're looking for rapid results and they just don't work that quickly. But an infection is not necessarily a death sentence in colonial days. It depends on where that infection's going. Small group our size, there's probably infection on 2 or 3 of us. I'm clumsy, I keep one pretty much all the time. But it gets down to what direction that infection's going to. If it's going to the inside, yes, you've got a true threat upon you. But if it's going to the outside, like perhaps that cut there, probably will be all right. So the infection doesn't mean that it's a death sentence. It really depends on how that infection is moving. That's the amputation.